Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the Assistant Director with NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness North Carolina. I'm so glad y'all are here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and building community on the topic of mental health. There are so many words in the English language that embody stigmatism on mental illness. One of the worst insults, one of the juiciest, is to call someone a psychopath. What does the word actually mean? What does psychopathy entail? How is it different from antisocial personality disorder, sociopathy, or conduct disorder in children? Our two guests tonight are well equipped to answer our questions as they have so much wonderful combination of professional and lived experience. We'll be doing a deep dive into this subject with our guests, Dr. Abigail Marsh and Lisa Michael, in just a moment. As usual, the first part of our show will be an interview with our guests. Partway through, we'll show a video of the week, and then we'll spend time with you taking your questions, members of our virtual studio audience on Facebook and Zoom. First, we'll do a word from our sponsors. And Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. We appreciate their guidance and support so very much. And moving right along, I'm so grateful that our guests can be here tonight, Dr. Abigail Marsh and Lisa Michael. Dr. Marsh is a neuroscientist and psychologist with Georgetown University. Lisa Michael is a family member and physics teacher in Sunnyvale, California. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And we'll dive right in with the questions. We like to know the background of our guests. So tell us about yourselves in a nutshell, and you can go in whichever order you prefer.
Lisa, do you want me to start?
Yeah.
All right, sure. Hi, I'm Abby Marsh. I'm a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Georgetown. I'm a social psychologist by training, so I'm not a clinician, but my background is in studying the origins of empathy and compassion, and particularly how these capacities develop over time. And I've spent about 15 or 16 years conducting brain imaging research with adolescents who have significant behavior problems, as well as adults, but mostly adolescents. And I'm interested in how their brains are developing differently from those of healthy kids. Over the years, I've worked with a lot of families, the parents in which are really struggling to manage their children's behavior problems, find therapists who have appropriate qualifications to diagnose and test their kids, find treatments that are effective. And I had always wished that I could offer more help to them than I was able to as just a researcher. And so when Lisa reached out to me, after having read an interview that I did, and said she was interested in joining with me to do more to help families, including creating this new organization we founded called Psychopathy Is, the express purpose of which is to get information out there about the truth about psychopathy so that affected families and individuals will not feel so alone, will be able to find correct information that they can trust, including a really quick, easy self-screener that's been well validated by science. And what we're looking at providing now is more resources to help families, lists of clinicians who can provide good screening and treatment, and eventually even more than that. But anyways, I'm really so happy that with Lisa's assistance, I've been able to make good on the promise I've made to so many families over the years that I would try to do something more concrete to help them.
Well, I know the families involved with NAMI will be really interested and really happy to hear about your work and learn about all that you're doing. And I imagine we'll be grateful as well. Lisa.
I am professionally an AP physics teacher in the San Francisco Bay Area for many of the past 35 years. In addition, I am a college town landlord and a licensed real estate broker. And I became involved with psychopathy because my older child clearly has this condition, but it didn't become clear till my child was in their late 20s. So a lot of suffering happened before then, and I am delighted to work with Dr. Marsh.
All right, well, welcome. And again, I know that our NAMI family members, I'm sure their experience will resonate with yours, and we look so forward to hearing what you both have to say. So we'll start with Dr. Marsh. What is psychopathy?
Great question. And I'm so glad you started off sort of talking about the myths and the stigmas around psychopathy, because I think those often get in the way of people understanding the reality of the condition. For better and for worse, I think in some ways the condition is not as scary as most people think it is, and in other ways it's a little more scary. So psychopathy is a constellation of personality traits, and the most generally accepted explanation of those traits is that they include callousness or meanness, so insensitivity to other people's suffering. And this is a trait that can emerge very early in childhood. Many parents of children with psychopathy say that this was something they noticed about their child when they were still a preschooler. It also includes interpersonal boldness and sort of a fearless disposition, at least for people who have what's called primary psychopathy, which means it didn't result from harmful environmental conditions that can cause antisocial behavior. So children and adults with primary psychopathy tend to have a really sort of charismatic, dominant, bold disposition that results in a lot of stimulation seeking and risky behavior, as well as a tendency to sort of dominate other people in interactions. And the last trait is disinhibition, which just means a difficulty overcoming impulses and some trouble with self-control, although this can vary quite a bit. So some people who are very bold and callous develop good inhibition as a compensatory factor growing up. And in fact, this is something that probably treatment strategies should look into more. Okay, so maybe you're never going to be the most warm, caring person in the world, but maybe we can develop strategies with you to help you inhibit your behavior so that you can still continue to function and flourish. These traits are continuously distributed across the population, which means there's no like psychopaths here and then everybody else over here. And one thing I'll mention is that I never, if I can help it, I will never use the term psychopath to refer to somebody with these traits, because we don't do that for any other condition, right? We don't talk about, people with autism as autists or people with schizophrenia as schizophrenics, at least not anymore. That used to be common practice. And so I think the same should be the case for psychopathy. So again, these traits are continuously distributed in the population. So lots of people have low levels of psychopathic traits, which is nothing to be particularly concerned about. But about 1% to 2% of the population has what's considered clinically significant levels of psychopathy, so that it impairs their ability to function as a friend, as a family member, in the workplace, in school. And this is when you need to start looking for treatment. You need to start looking at interventions that work. Because if you don't address these issues when they arise, psychopathy tends to be persistent across the life course. So children who have these traits tend to get worse as they get older and are at very high risk for developing long-term antisocial behavior patterns, which can include criminal behavior, substance use issues, and all sorts of other very high-risk behaviors if nothing is done to address them.
Okay. Very comprehensive answer. Thank you for that. And Lisa, do you have, from the family perspective, any follow-up?
No, not about that. No.
Okay. And question 2, what is the most common reason that children are referred to therapy?
Well, officially by the numbers, the most common reason that children are referred to mental health therapists in North America is for what are called externalizing behavior problems, which just mean behaviors that are outwardly directed and are causing other people problems. And that's as compared to internalizing problems, which usually relate to mood and anxiety disorders. And so, the reason for this is not that surprising. Children whose psychological disorder results in them doing things that harm other people, it's incredibly disruptive to social relationships, to the family's ability to function, sometimes to the health and safety of other members of the family. And so I think parents who have kids who have externalizing problems, which, by the way, can co-occur with internalizing problems. It's very common for people who have psychopathy to receive other diagnoses as well. Maybe 70% of all people with psychopathy qualify for a diagnosis of ADHD, for example. In any case, it's not surprising that given how disruptive this is to other members of the family, it's very common for parents to seek help. Unfortunately, they too often don't find it.
Got it. So when a child is diagnosed with both ADHD and psychopathy, is that a comorbidity or is that a mistake?
It's a great question. I wish we knew the answer to things like this. There's, uh, it's possible, and in fact, it's probable that most kinds of disordered behavior patterns that we can see in both adults and children, there's more than one way to get to that outcome. And we know that this is true for aggression, for example. So people who have psychopathic traits can be aggressive, although they aren't always. But you can be aggressive for other reasons as well. So many people who have serious anxiety problems also are aggressive. Many people who have impulse control problems also are aggressive. And so just because you see one particular kind of behavior, you can't know for sure what are the sort of neural and cognitive processes that led to that outcome. And so when we see, psychopathic traits manifesting, because disinhibition is a part of psychopathy, it's very common to get that ADHD diagnosis. What we don't know is you get to that disinhibited stimulation-seeking pattern a different way if you have psychopathic traits versus if you have just pure ADHD. It's possible, but it almost certainly involves common pathways in the brain. And so this is one reason that probably stimulant drugs that are meant for kids with ADHD do tend to be effective in helping kids with psychopathy as well. I mean, they won't get rid of all of the problems, but they will help with some of them. The other thing I want to mention real quick is that psychopathy is not an official diagnosis in the DSM, unfortunately. There's a little sort of experimental section at the DSM where you'll see it included, but it isn't really. That said, the closest thing to true psychopathy in the DSM is when a child has a diagnosis of conduct disorder with limited prosocial emotions. And that's a brand new specifier in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. As of the most recent version in 2013, my research was some of the research that new specifier was based on, because there's such good evidence that kids who have conduct disorder with these traits have a completely different set of emotional and social problems than kids who have conduct disorder and do not have limited prosocial emotions.
And just as a reminder, I can't remember if we said this, ADHD stands for attention deficit, is it hyperactivity disorder?
That's right, exactly. Thank you for clarifying.
Thank you. All right. And Lisa, what does psychopathy look like in an adult?
I'll describe how it looks in my adult child. My child started showing symptoms when they were 3. At least, maybe even younger. I just was distinctly different from other kids, and I thought that's just how this kid is. I didn't know it was anything. In an adult, what I would say is the demeanor and treatment of me and other people is jaw-droppingly cold-hearted, nasty even, and consistent. So there's not any sort of remorsefulness, like, oh, I'm sorry I stormed out on you, or I'm sorry, none of that. It's really shocking. And that the consistency, the coldness, the meanness is what made me say when my child was 27, I'm going to find out what's going on here, and I'm not going to stop till I get answers that make sense. Because what I had been told by at least one therapist who my child had seen, or maybe we had seen them together, was, well, you two just don't get along. And I thought, well, this is not how it looks like when a parent and child don't get along. I mean, there are parents and children that don't get along. This is not what it looks like. One person terrorized by another, which is what it actually was. Also, my child is very manipulative and will blame other people for things that either they're not doing at all or that are actually that child's responsibility. I have a vignette in my head where my other child was actually in the hospital, and I was very distraught. And I literally remember, I could have the vision of where I was. We were in a hotel in New York, and my child with psychopathy looked down at me and said, that's not really normal how you're reacting, and walked out. Didn't have even a shred of sympathy for how I would have been feeling with my younger kid in the hospital, and doesn't double back on it. Like, that is the end of it. Very, very poorly attached to anybody, very willing to take advantage, stole money from me for a thing I bought for us jointly, used it behind my back without me knowing. I can't say anything good about it, I'm afraid to say. And I would describe myself as being emotionally abused by that child. I don't think there's a better way of saying it. And I would say that trying to cultivate a relationship with that child would be the equivalent of somebody who's abused by their partner going back to that partner only to get abused again. Sorry, but there is no good news there.
Well, I admire your candor. It's hard to be that candid and transparent with a difficult relationship. I've had my share in and beyond my family. And I understand, for me at least, it comes with a lot of shame, and you're giving people permission to have their experience and to talk about their experience. And that's what we're about here at Thursdays with NAMI and with NAMI in general. So thank you for that. Lisa, or I'm sorry, Dr. Marsh, what follow-up do you have?
I also appreciate so much how candid Lisa is being with her own experiences, and has been since we first got to know each other, because I have worked with many families over the years who are really hesitant to share what's going on openly. And I think completely understandable. I absolutely understand why parents are hesitant to tell others what's going on with their child. But unfortunately, when it's so common, I think it really contributes to the pervasive shame and stigma, because just the way it used to be true with autism decades ago, people would sort of suffer in silence and feel very ashamed. And then the more people sort of came out, so to speak, and said, yeah, this is something that affects my family too, the more people could realize that it's not that rare. 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 people are affected by both autism and psychopathy. So that's not rare in the scheme of things. And then once it becomes something that's not so rare, it becomes much less stigmatized. People can join together for mutual support. We can start developing the resources that we need to help treat children even more effectively than we can now, get families the resources they need. And eventually, my hope is that psychopathy will take the same trajectory that autism did, which, if you remember, autism, also a neurodevelopmental disorder, starts very early in childhood, and can involve some socially disruptive behaviors, although it shouldn't be confused with psychopathy in any other way. But once upon a time, children who had autism, their mothers were blamed for causing it by their bad parenting, right? That was a whole thing, the refrigerator mother model of autism. And unfortunately, we're still there for psychopathy. There's a very pervasive myth out there that the reason that children develop these traits is because they must have really terrible parents. And as is true for Lisa, as is true for every family that I've ever worked with, other children in the family are doing fine. And so clearly it can't be just bad parenting that's giving children the traits that we see when they have psychopathic traits. And so we need to dig a little deeper. I think we need to release parents, especially moms, as we know, get the extra helping of the blame from that sort of accusation, and instead treat both children and adults with psychopathy as people with disorders who maybe don't elicit the most compassion because their behaviors make it really hard to feel compassion for them. I get it, I know. And yet that doesn't mean they don't need treatment. And if they could get the treatment and the resources they need, everybody's better off. They're more likely to flourish in their own lives, their families, their communities are healthier and safer. It's still the best thing to do, even when it's hard.
Right, absolutely. Lisa, you look to me like there's something on your mind. Anything?
I was going to add, I was actually making notes. I would actually like to say I'm actually afraid of this child, which is why I'm referring to the child as this child, in case this child, this could ever be tracked under this child's name or even this child's sex or anything. And I would also say, you're very emotionally afraid of this child. And for a while I was physically afraid. I don't know what this kid is capable of. For all I know, I even had a notion of how they would try to hurt me. It got that far. I think they're going to try to hurt me this way, with this method. I would say before I became fairly open about what's going on, there was 27 years of not that, or really, I guess I didn't really know. By the time the child was 3, I noticed something. And so there was 24 years of not that. There was me feeling like, maybe, do I deserve this? You know, the treatment of me was so horrible. You know, I'm not strong in that way. And I thought, maybe I deserve this. There was a lot of that. And then there was sort of me trying to ignore it or trying to deny that it was that bad. And then finally there was the like appeasement phase where I'm like, well, I'm just going to just be the most indulgent, you know, the most friendly parent. And finally there was like, I give up. But that wasn't for 24 years. So there was 24 years of me running from it before I couldn't run from it anymore. It was so bad.
Well, I can only imagine. It sounds incredibly difficult, and it does sound like the sort of the phases of coping with an abuser. So that must have just been incredibly difficult.
Interestingly, there are other countries where child on parent abuse is recognized as a common form of domestic violence, and resources are much more readily available, and there's a name for it. And so parents who are experiencing abuse from their children, emotional or physical, again, don't have to feel so alone. And for some reason in this country, that just hasn't caught on. Like people, the sort of public awareness about this form of domestic violence is just not that well. I don't know. It hasn't disseminated very well. I wish I knew. And so this is one of the reasons we like to do things like this, to make sure people realize this is a recognized form of domestic violence. It's just, it isn't talked about as often.
It's really interesting. Fascinating is a comment that came up in the chat box. We do seem to have kind of rigid ideas about family and relationships and the way things happen, I guess, in this country.
Yeah, and I think there's a tendency to see children as sort of innocent, and you know, that if they're acting in a way that's bad, well, the only way that could be is if somebody did something bad to them first. And sometimes that is true, right? Sometimes people who do terrible things, it's because they're wounded and somebody has done something terrible to them. That can happen, but it's not the only way that it happens. You know, again, I know too many families where the parents are doing the best job they can, other children in the family doing fine, and you know, they just have a child whose brain is developing differently. And the child does sometimes really callous and cruel things as a result. The parents feel like they're to blame.
Sure, it's only natural. So how can, if a child has conduct disorder, well, first of all, let's look at the difference between psychopathy and conduct disorder.
Absolutely. So conduct disorder is a relatively common disorder of childhood. It's again, an externalizing behavior disorder. So the typical symptoms of conduct disorder include aggression, tantrums, delinquent type behavior, truancy, theft. Those are the biggest categories. A lot of deceit and lying sometimes. And some children who have conduct disorder because of, you know, a myriad of environmental factors, which could be anything from neglect or trauma or abuse to having a delinquent peer group. It's extremely common for children who, with conduct disorder, to develop it only in adolescence. These are not children with psychopathy. These are children who are maybe a little more stimulation seeking than usual, you know, end up with a group of peers who engage in delinquent behavior, themselves engage in delinquent behavior during adolescence that will qualify them for conduct disorder. And then when they get into adulthood, they desist and all is well. That is a common pattern of conduct disorder. Other kids with conduct disorder, their problem seems to be emotional dysregulation. So there's a lot of anger, a lot of outbursts, a lot of anxiety, and you see sort of wildly dysregulated behavior that can include aggression and other sorts of antisocial behaviors. Those children also typically do not have psychopathy, at least not primary psychopathy. The children who have primary psychopathy, or as it's often referred to in childhood, callous unemotional traits, or again, limited prosocial emotions, from an early age, what you tend to see is that they again, have a little bit of a fearless temperament. They don't seem afraid of the things that cause other children to be afraid. And, you know, some children are afraid of dogs, some are afraid of the water, some are afraid of the dark, you know, but children who will go on to develop psychopathy later just seem a little bit less ruffled by just about anything, and sometimes can be quite daredevilish. And in addition, they tend not to show as much interest in social rewards. And so by that, I mean they don't seek as much affection, and they often don't give as much affection. You know, they're very sort of unreceptive to hugs or saying I love you, except if they're manipulating somebody. When they learn that saying I love you will get them something, then that's a little different. And then as they go on, you start to see more rule breaking behavior, sometimes aggression. You know, when they're in early school years, a little bit of manipulative behavior will start. And then as they move into adolescence, you'll start seeing the more full conduct disorder profile in some cases. Again, aggression, theft, manipulation, delinquency and truancy, not caring at all about consequences in school from this behavior, not seeming to care about breaking relationships with other people. One thing you notice in both children and adults with conduct disorder, well, in adults it's called antisocial personality disorder, who also have psychopathy, is that they make friends often quite easily because they're very charismatic. They're really fun to talk to, but they often don't keep friends very well. They burn their bridges. They seem really fun and lively at the beginning, and then unless they've worked on becoming a more sort of high functioning person, as what I should mention is that 2 of the members of our board of psychopathy is themselves have been assessed as having psychopathy. And in the past had really serious behavior problems. Both of them sought treatment, and are high functioning in relationships, are doing well in their lives now, and I think are a really good sort of cause for optimism about what can happen when people with psychopathy get serious about wanting their own lives to go better, which means treating other people better. It is a change that can happen. And I know we veered off a little bit from the topic of conduct disorder, but basically what you're looking for with conduct disorder is a persistent pattern of behavior that violates the rights and welfare of other people. Again, aggression, tantrums, theft, lying, manipulation, and delinquency are the major categories.
Okay. No, that was all very interesting. I appreciate your sharing your thoughts with us.
Mm-hmm.
So if a child has conduct disorder, what's going on with their brain development?
Great question. So again, it seems to be the case that children who have conduct disorder, there's more than one route that you can take to get there in terms of brain development. Children who have emotion regulation issues, which is probably a slight majority of children with conduct disorder, the problem is a combination of being overly emotionally reactive, so having very strong emotional reactions to things, having a bit of a tendency to see social cues as threatening or hostile when they're not. So this is what's called hostile attribution bias, and it is a strong predictor of aggression in both children and adults. It's tending to see somebody who accidentally knocks into you or who looks at you with just sort of a blank expression on their face as angry or hostile, rather than, you know, that's ambiguous. I don't exactly know what that information meant. And some people just always go to the worst possible explanation for other people's behavior, and that can predispose to aggression. And then finally, a big predictor of aggressive behavior at any age is having trouble regulating your behavior. So failing to appreciate that the short-term rewards of, for example, stealing aren't worth the long-term consequences. The short-term rewards of bullying somebody to, you know, get a rise out of them, to gain status, aren't worth the long-term consequences of the damage it will do to social relationships. And then children who have psychopathy show a little bit different pattern, which is they are emotionally underreactive. And so there's a region of the brain called the amygdala that I focus on in particular, that doesn't seem to react very strongly to the possibility of being punished, to the possibility of being hurt. And that's a normal job, is to register what bad thing might happen if I do this, and help you regulate your behavior in connection with other brain regions. It also seems to be really important for some forms of empathy. And so children who have psychopathy or callous unemotional traits and conduct disorder, it seems to be the case that because they have sort of a fearless, dominant temperament themselves, it's sort of hard for them to empathize when other people are feeling emotions like fear, because they don't really feel that emotion. And the locus of that deficit seems to be in problems of the amygdala. that seem to have the biggest effect on outcomes in the first 10 years of life. This is one of the reasons we think early treatment is so important. A lot of development of sort of the moral brain, which includes connections between the amygdala and the parts of the brain involved in decision making. A lot of that wiring up happens before adolescence. And so the earlier we can get to kids and help that set of brain networks wire up better, the better off we'll all be. And so again, what seems to be the case is some kids with conduct disorder, structures like the amygdala are underactive and also too small compared to other kids. And that seems to lead to low empathy and this fearless, punishment insensitive temperament. Other kids with conduct disorder, if anything, their amygdala is overreactive. It overreacts to everything. It treats everything like a threat, even if it's not. And then all of them seem to have trouble with the frontal regions of the brain as well, which is the region involved in helping you regulate your behavior, regulate your emotions, and delay short-term rewards in the interest of getting longer-term rewards.
Okay, very good. And Lisa, do you have any thoughts that have come to you hearing this explanation?
Yeah. My daughter was never afraid of me at all. And no amount of my disapproval, it was confusing, seemed to concern her. But she was very into trying to make other people think she was scared of me, because she found that advantageous, like in therapy situations, where she plainly was not only not afraid of me, but just was totally unafraid of me at all. There was a interesting example when she was already in her 20s, where she came to a family function with someone supposedly in a very cagey way, but like to like I don't know, be like a support person, because she was afraid of me. She didn't say it that way. It was really obvious. And I thought, who was actually afraid of someone would possibly do that? Because you'd be so afraid of arousing the anger of that person. She's so manipulative. It's just beyond it. And not the least bit afraid of me, no matter what I did.
That would be, yeah, that would be utterly confusing as a parent, just not to have that typical reaction right from the get-go.
No, not even a little concerned, like not concerned. Oh, mom doesn't like that. Just completely not impressed with that, and would make a bigger frowny face, or try to like grab control of things, like would storm out, and would try to make me feel like very, very manipulative, very, very emotionally abusive towards me. There was this one incident where I was standing outside the bathroom that she was in, with my arms sort of across it so she wouldn't run out, and then she pretended to hyperventilate. I mean, I really wish there were people there to see this stuff, because she couldn't get out of the bathroom. I mean, just the absurdity of dealing with her was so extreme.
So having gone through the ordeal that you've gone through, what words of wisdom might you pass on to other parents?
I would say start looking at Google when your kid is 3. I wish I had start when she was, well, I guess much younger. By the time she was 3, symptoms were showing up. By the time she was 7, 8, I was sure there was something. I just didn't know what it was. It was very cold, hostile, hard-hearted, very much. There was a, I guess I was sure by the time she was 5, because when she was 5, I remember she was in a swimming pool and came out to hug me and said she was the kissing girl. And I was like, well, that's weird. She never, ever does that, ever. She's cold. She wants to get out of the pool. So at that point, my subconscious was certain that she was utterly unaffectionate and cold. And I wish I'd start looking into it then.
But you did seek help along the way, and you found yourself getting blamed, and you didn't find actual help. Isn't that right?
I didn't seek out a lot of help, and it was more late. Nothing when she was sub 12. Nothing, because we didn't know what to make out of it. Just, oh, she'll grow out of it. We didn't know. And the general gist of people's reaction to all along was, I think, a lot of people noticed she was frowny faced and didn't respect me at all. But that, oh, she's not doing drugs, and her grades are good. So like, what's your problem with her? More like that.
Okay. Okay.
She wasn't physically violent, and those things are true. She wasn't doing drugs. She wasn't physically violent.
There's a real gender bias, I think, when it comes to seeing these sorts of traits in girls. And I think because it's true that girls are less likely to be physically violent, and I think just because of stereotypes that we all have about girls, sometimes it's the case that girls who have these conditions, clinicians assume that the problem must be depression or anxiety because those are common in adolescent girls, and they see everything through the lens of, well, what else could be causing problems in an adolescent girl other than depression or anxiety? And it's important to consider those options, of course, but I think unfortunately some clinicians are just unwilling to consider other alternatives for reasons that I don't fully understand, although there are some objectively important reasons. For example, I have heard from some clinicians that the insurance companies they work with will not reimburse for treatment of a child whose primary diagnosis is conduct disorder. Because the insurance companies view it as a parenting problem. It's not a real illness. Oh yeah, there's an NPR article that direct quote is in, and I've worked with other clinicians who said the same thing. And so they make up other diagnoses. They're like, we'll call them bipolar. We'll say they have something else. And that becomes the official diagnosis because otherwise they know that they will not get reimbursed for the treatment, and which of course like terribly muddies the waters. And that just reveals how many layers deep this problem of thinking of externalizing aggressive behavior as not a real illness goes. I mean, way deep into the mental health prevention or mental health profession, providers, insurers, it's this real bias against thinking about disorders characterized by externalizing as real disorders. People want to classify them as like, sorry, there's my dog, as, signs that you're a bad person or that that you have bad parents instead of, you have a disorder and it needs treatment.
That's unbelievable. Yeah. If I look at it from the perspective of insurance parity, that's incredible.
Indeed.
And yeah, how can you have equal care when you can't diagnose correctly, you can't document correctly because you won't get paid otherwise?
Right. And then we end up with children whose extremely serious antisocial behavior ends up causing terrible tragedies. And I can't tell you how many times I was just in contact with a parent this week who contacted a psychopathy researcher I know looking for help because nobody will help them. They're like, our daughter is dangerous. She is a risk to herself, to our family, to other people. Everybody wants to focus on getting her back integrated with the family. She is dangerous. We need her in an institution, and nobody will do it. This is a well-connected family, but they're having an incredible amount of difficulty actually getting anyone to take the problem seriously. It's a really pervasive problem, and we've all seen the news headlines of the tragedies that result when families can't get the help that they need. And not that every child with psychopathy will end up doing something truly terrible. And many of the children who do end up, for example, shooting children in a school, many of those children do not have psychopathy. Some do, but many don't. That said, all of them have serious conduct problems, most of which are treatable, and too little is done.
All right. Any advice for mothers and fathers on how they can take care of themselves in that situation?
Would you like to take this one first, Lisa?
I'm thinking, what would I say to myself, myself when my daughter was 5? Maybe my advice would be, if your gut tells you something is amiss with your child, your gut's probably correct. Because I kept putting that aside. I didn't have a name for it yet. I mean, it's now all very clear, but it certainly wasn't for years, and years. And my gut told me it's not just that we don't get along. None of the answers or nothing seemed right that I heard. I would have pursued it more strongly when she was much younger. That would be my advice.
It's interesting. It sounds like there was no language, there was no external validation. And so you just had nowhere to go with it.
There's just no language for it at all. Like I didn't know a language for it. Like because I would be like, well, because she doesn't really have a bad temper. She doesn't really yell. I didn't even know what to call it. When the first time I saw a description that fit it perfectly was when I stumbled across an article or a blog post, I guess, online by Dr. Carrie Barron, who's now on our board of directors. And I was like, yeah, that's what my daughter has. That, what she described there is, that's it. And she called it malignant narcissism. And till then, I had never seen a description that was like, that's what she has. When I said in 2017, I'm not going to stop till I get answers, the first thing I thought was, is she borderline? I'm like, nah, she's not quite borderline. There just was no language for whatever it was. To me, somebody with psychopathy was a murderer. That's what I thought that was. And she's not a murderer, or she's at least a violent criminal. She's not a violent, but she wasn't even a criminal. So I had absolutely no language for it. I did feel ultimately tearful, but also sad and also furious, because somewhere inside I knew I was getting emotionally abused, but I didn't know why.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should say, criminality and violence are not criteria required for someone to qualify as having psychopathy. And again, this is especially true with women whose psychopathy often doesn't manifest that way. It can, but it doesn't always. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about psychopathy, is that it's about crime or it's about violence. And again, it does increase the risk of both of those things. It is related. But that need not be the only way that it manifests. And in some people, it manifests as just a pattern of constant low-level cruelty and not caring about the way that your behavior causes other people to suffer. And one of the taglines for our website is, we all know somebody with psychopathy, because most people don't realize, like, oh, that person is like so untrustworthy, and they're not nice to people for like no reason sometimes. And I've just learned, like, I can't trust them with my feelings. And often it's the case that is what the issue is with that person. It's funny, one of our web developers, in entering the criteria for the psychopathy self-screener for the website when we were creating our online screener, she realized, she's like, oh, I never realized that this is a problem with somebody in her extended family. She's like, we just thought he wasn't a very nice guy. I was like, well, he probably isn't. And she told us exactly what about him was not a nice guy. I'm like, well, he's not a nice guy, clearly, but I think that this is the reason. And it is nice. It's comforting to give it a name. I think this is helpful for some parents to be like, this is a thing. This is something that exists in the world. It has a name. It has causes. This isn't just, me being a bad parent or me not being able to figure out how to connect with my kid. It's something a lot deeper than that. And I would recommend that parents, if you're not getting a satisfying answer, reach out, like keep reaching out until you have somebody who says, yes, I have experience with this. We have some resources on our site. If a parent completes one of our screeners on behalf of their child, it will then direct you to a sort of an information sheet that can be taken into a meeting with a clinician. Obviously, our site cannot take the place of an actual meeting with a clinician. You can start with a pediatrician, you can start with a psychologist, a school counselor, anything, and then ask for recommendations from there. But if you bring in a sheet from our website, at least it will make sure that they have to consider and recognize the possibility of psychopathy rather than dismissing it.
Absolutely. And if you're hearing these descriptions and stories and thinking, wow, maybe I myself have a problem, there's no shame in that. I mean, it takes a lot of courage to admit to yourself and take that first step to get help. So there's no judgment. Please reach out for help. You can start to repair your relationships and you can start to see things in a different way. There's always hope.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. Yes, again, I think it's so important to reinforce that two members of the board of our organization themselves have been assessed as having psychopathy. And they realized after a while how damaging it was to their own lives to treat people the way that they were treating them. Sought therapy, took it seriously, and their own lives are so dramatically improved by the changes they've made in sort of their emotional structure and their social relationships. It's really a win-win for everybody.
That's right. All right, we're going to take a quick break and wrap up the interview portion of the show. We want to be sure to get to the questions that are coming from Zoom and Facebook audience members. I want to give a big shout out, first of all, to those working behind the scenes, especially NAMI North Carolina Executive Director Gary Kreitz on the chat box, psychiatric nurse Gail Pruitt on Facebook, and of course, thank you so much to our guests, Lisa Michael and Dr. Abigail Marsh. Now our video of the week. We try to do something lighthearted. Our conversations can be on the heavy side here at Thursdays with NAMI. So here's something fun. This is a holiday video featuring NAMI North Carolina mascot Juniper Morrison. All righty. All right, well, something fun, something different. And thanks for the comment that you love Juniper. I love her as well, Suzanne. So we have some questions lined up from our virtual studio audience. And this references Family to Family, which is NAMI's flagship class that teaches loved ones and family members of folks with mental health challenges. What is a diagnosis and how can we cope? So in Family to Family support, we have many parents supporting minor and adult children who struggle with mental illness. The description of this illness was far too familiar to resembling the descriptions of the parents. From the parents. Is it difficult to be sure of this diagnosis? What are some therapy options or medications that are helpful?
Sorry, I muted myself during the video. Yeah, so the question is it hard to be sure of the diagnosis and what are therapy and treatment options? It can be difficult, especially in adults. We now know that other personality disorders have a lot of overlapping symptoms. And so people who have, for example, narcissistic personality disorder, borderline, antisocial personality disorder, there's a lot of overlap. And in children, it's also the case that children who have conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, some new inclusions to the DSM, relatively new, like intermittent explosive disorder, they all can look similar in some ways. And so it's really important that anything you find online, and including completing our web screener, is just considered a first step. And seeing a clinician who's got the time and the experience to tease out what is actually going on is essential. Because if you have, for example, here's a good example from two more familiar disorders, bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. Both of them can manifest as bouts of depression, and yet that we know if you give somebody with bipolar disorder the SSRIs that are often used to treat major depression, you can actually make bipolar disorder worse, or you can sometimes precipitate a manic episode. It's really important to get a skilled diagnostician to make sure that you're looking at the right thing. And the same is true for children with conduct disorder, for example. If you have a child who is hyper emotional, you don't want to give them the same kinds of treatments as you would give a child who is hypo-emotional, even though either kind of problem can manifest as conduct disorder. And it's something that takes, I think, many years for somebody to learn to do well. When it comes to treatment, I think in general, it's pretty well accepted that behavioral or psychotherapy should be the first line treatment, and it tends to be extremely effective, especially when children are young. And there's a couple of different kinds of therapy that have been demonstrated to be effective for children who have problems related to psychopathy, though not only. Children with conduct problems that result from more than one cause can be helped by, for example, a kind of therapy called family checkup, or FCU. It's not offered by all clinicians, but any clinician can learn to do it. And family checkup therapy is a very brief, tailored form of therapy that absolutely can help children who have serious conduct problems. There's another kind of therapy called integrated family intervention that works well and has been demonstrated to help children who have callous unemotional or psychopathic traits. And another form of therapy called parent management training. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is 3 kinds of psychotherapy that have been demonstrated to be effective for children with serious conduct problems, including psychopathy. Again, our website has more details. Medication, if the therapy itself is not having the effects you might like, medication can also be a treatment approach that works. The most common medications that are prescribed for children with psychopathy are stimulants, the same kinds that are used to treat ADHD. And there's some evidence that in some children, antipsychotic medications can help. You don't have to be psychotic, with psychosis being delusions and hallucinations and disordered thinking characteristic of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. But the medications that treat those symptoms also may have some effect on reducing aggression. They may be overprescribed, but then again, if you have a child for whom nothing else is working and they're a risk to themselves and their family, it's a reasonable thing to try. And off-label, lots of other things are prescribed as well. Some children get anti-anxiety medications or serotonin-related mood medications. As is unfortunately too often the case, there's a lot of trial and error involved. I mean, even if somebody has obvious major depression, you often have to try a couple different kinds of antidepressant before something effective is found. And the same is very much true for psychopathy. But I should really emphasize that getting good behavioral therapy and family-focused therapy should absolutely be the first-line treatment, and it's unfortunately not used often enough.
Lisa, thoughts?
No, nothing to add.
Okay. And this is probably also for Dr. Marsh first. What is the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy?
Yes, that's a great question. So for whatever reason, I don't quite know, and I have tried to get to the bottom of it. The term sociopath or sociopathy is preferred in like the general media. Even in that, what was the song? Good for You by Olivia Rodrigo. There's a line in there about somebody acting like a damn sociopath. I was like, no, not you too. This term just is very sticky. It emerged in, I think, the 60s and 70s. I believe initially as an attempt to supplant the term psychopathy, which had become a very stigmatizing label, not surprisingly. And it also had come to connote somebody who was this, quote unquote, bad seed, who there was just something fundamentally bad about that couldn't be fixed. And the term sociopath sort of emerged to denote that some people's antisocial behavior is a product of social forces, that they have been traumatized or abused or neglected, and that is the reason that they're behaving antisocially. And again, sometimes that is true. And then ultimately, the term sociopath sometimes came to be used to denote somebody had been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. That's not the official DSM sort of conclusion, but it is a very commonly used shorthand for antisocial personality disorder. Now, the problem with the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder is it's a real grab bag. It's very general. It just basically means people who do bad things a lot and who break the law a lot. It doesn't really help you understand the causes of the disorder. And I should emphasize the term sociopath is not a scientific term. There's no journal, if you look for, scholarly scientific articles on sociopathy, you'll find nothing. There's no, scientific society of sociopathy, none of that. There is a scientific society for the study of psychopathy, which I'm a member of. Tons of articles out there in scholarly journals about psychopathy. It's very well accepted and recognized term scientifically, but for whatever reason, it just hasn't been as like taken up in the general parlance. And so I would say they're used to mean roughly the same thing. Scientists will never use the term sociopath in general. And so psychopath or psychopathy is the accepted scientific clinical term, and sociopath is not. That's probably the simplest way to put it.
Okay. All right, thank you. That does help clear it up.
Mhm.
And this from Suzanne. I think you said addictive behavior and substance abuse is often additionally an issue. Is that correct?
Oh boy, yes. Many people with psychopathy have substance use disorders. There's some thinking that they are less likely to become dependent on various substances, but I wouldn't call that the definitive conclusion, but some people believe that that's true. However, there's a lot of substance use in people with psychopathy. It's very common. The other wrinkle is that people who develop substance use disorders can often act as though they have psychopathy while they are experiencing the disorder. And so people who have serious substance use disorders can often engage in aggression, manipulation, theft, deceit, all sorts of things that look very psychopathic. But once you get rid of the substance use disorder and they have, overcome any sort of lingering dependence on the substance and they're back to their baseline self, they stop acting that way. And so that can be a really difficult distinction to make sometimes too. Somebody I know well, a family member, developed a very serious opioid use disorder. And everybody said, oh, this person's psychopathic. I'm like, I don't think so, because they didn't act that way before the disorder. And then once they managed to get treatment and overcome the disorder, they stopped acting that way. So that's a really important distinction to make.
That's tricky. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, but it is possible to both have psychopathy and a substance use disorder too. So it's important to know how people act when they're not, dependent on the substance.
Got it. Lisa.
No, I don't think to add to that.
Okay. Can always pass. This is for Dr. Marsh. Would you please repeat the other types of therapy that may be helpful for children/families in addition to family checkup?
Yes, one is called parent management training. And another one is called integrated family intervention. And again, if you go to the psychopathyis.org website, under resources, you'll see a section on treatment, and it lists these forms of treatment and also lots more details about them, as well as links to learn even more about them.
Perfect. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
I had a feeling lots of folks would be interested in hearing that one.
Yeah. And these, by the way, are focused on children and families. There are other approaches that have been shown to be effective to varying degrees for adults.
And Lisa, how did you learn you were not the cause of your child's problems?
Well, that's a really good question. And I considered that very specifically when I said in December 27, 2017, that was the day, I'm going to find out what's going on now. I'm not going to get stopped till I get answers that make sense. I actually asked my son's psychiatrist if she would see me to talk about this problem, my younger child. And I went in the first day and I said, somebody's mentally ill. It's either me or my daughter, or maybe both of us. I don't know. You can tell me if it's me, because I'll never get her in here. And by that point, that child was living on the opposite coast. And we had lengthy that was one of the first things I said. I said, like, here are the worst things I've ever done as a parent. I'll just say them all to you, blah, blah, whatever they were. And are those things abusive? And she's like, who gave you that idea? So, I mean, I that's the first thing I considered. And I think and she felt, the psychiatrist felt, the reason I even considered that is because of how emotionally abused I'd been by my daughter, because she thought it was so far away from what had happened. and that someone of a reasonable level of education should know that why was I even considering that? So that's my answer. I did consider
My
that.
goodness.
Mhm.
Another one for Lisa. How do you cope with the emotional challenges on a day-to-day level that persist now that you're away from your child?
So actually, my other child and I have had several conversations about this child, and I cannot have changed her trajectory, as she was clearly born like, well, maybe I could have had I known when she was 3, but she was clearly born with something, because the symptoms showed up when she was 3. And in fact, as I paged back, they probably showed up when she was an infant, because I do remember that she didn't need to be picked up a lot or hugged a lot, which seemed like an enormous advantage when she was an infant, and we could take her to really fancy restaurants and she would be silent and not needing anything. People were like, how do you get your baby to do that? So that was probably the first sign that she didn't need any touching or hugging, or and so as a result of that, I just feel like that happened. I couldn't stop it. I've been the victim of it, rather. And I feel good about co-founding Psychopathy with Dr. Marsh to hope to do something about it. That's how I cope. I think of Psychopathy as my 3rd child, actually. And also thinking about the various other parents that I know and parents out there suffering that I don't know. I feel that I'm thinking about it on all of our behalfs.
And I really hope that Lisa's example, which I admire so much, will inspire other affected family members to come forward and share their own experiences. Maybe, as Lisa has done, put their own suffering and experiences into action to help others. So through Lisa's generosity, we've been able to create this nonprofit organization, and our website is now visited by thousands and thousands of people a week. I've lost count of how many people have taken our online screener. And as somebody who also studies compassion and pro-social behavior, I know that one of the best ways to handle distressing emotional experiences is to channel them into doing things to help other people. And I think it was, and Lisa's very wise to have, just decided that, she's going to take this horrible experience that she's been through and channel it into helping other parents so that they don't have to in the future go through what she's gone through.
I would also hasten to add that although I'm talking about it here, actually very few people who know me personally know what has gone on. Family members do, and a few very close friends, and of course mental health professionals that I've talked to or that my son has talked to. But other than that, even pretty good friends don't really know, because I don't talk about it, and I'm very evasive when asked about my older kid.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm also honor and salute both of you for coming together to form Psychopathy, is to get the word out about an overlooked and much maligned disorder that needs to be addressed. It needs to be okay for people to say, I've endured this relationship and it's hurt me very much. And people need to be able to say, I have some regrets and I think I need help. So absolutely, those are so important. And a question for either or both of you: how can parents learn to defend themselves? That's a tough one.
That is a tough one. Oh, Lisa, you want to start with that one?
Yeah. I would say that my kid is so manipulative that anything I would do to try to steer the situation, any interaction with her that was difficult in any way, which are, let's get real, almost always caused by her, to be honest, she would manipulate it around to that I was causing her grief. Like that time I was standing outside the bathroom and she tried to convince me she was having a panic attack, which was clearly a fake panic attack. I mean, she was I think that with someone like that, the best way is to have very limited interaction.
Mm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the age, that's certainly my recommendation.
Yeah, sorry, she was already adult. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. So, with somebody who's psychopathic, whether they're related to you or not, if they're actively engaging in behavior that's harmful to other people and they are not remorseful for it, there is no choice other than to try to protect yourself by limiting contact and limiting your exposure and risk. Um, there's nothing else can be done at that point. With younger children, it's harder. It's much harder, especially when they're, young enough to still be dependent on you. Certainly the best thing to do is try to get effective treatment to minimize the seriousness of their behavior. For some families, institutionalization for the child is the only option remaining. Nothing else seems to be working and they have to protect themselves and their other children. And there are, a lot of bad institutions out there for children who have serious behavior problems. That's been in the news recently. But there are good ones too. And, for some parents, there just isn't another way to keep everybody safe, unfortunately. So that isn't always an option. I mean, there's a bunch of resources on our site about this, and we've worked with some parents who have dealt with this issue themselves personally, who have recommendations as to how to go about it. It's a complicated problem. If your child's young, very young, and not in a position they can do too much harm yet, I mean, that's the time to really go all in on these therapeutic parenting approaches that we think can help, which involve something paradoxical because it doesn't seem like that's what the child wants, which is extremely warm, positive parenting, warmer and more positive than you even think the child, like a typical child, needs or wants. But there's some evidence to suggest that children who were born at very high risk of developing psychopathy and are parented at sort of on the extreme high end of what's called the sort of warm responsive parenting spectrum, again, beyond what normal parents do. It's a therapeutic approach that can overcome their sort of relatively low responsiveness to warmth and affection. If you sort of give them the high end of it, even if they don't seem to want it, and that may have the ability to reduce their risk of developing serious problems in the long term. But again, we're in the very early stages of trying to understand how that works.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I say this all because I don't want parents to feel helpless, even if it's not caused by bad parenting. That doesn't mean that there aren't family-based approaches that can help. Again, just like autism. Autism is not caused by bad parenting, but we know that some of the effective treatments for young children who have serious autism spectrum disorders are family-based behavioral therapies. So, a parenting approach doesn't have to be the cause of the problem, but it can still be the solution. And I think the same is true for psychopathy.
Sure, that makes sense. Whatever intervention needs to happen won't take place in a vacuum. It doesn't point to someone being at fault.
Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
All right. So thank you for that question, Kent. Next question, are individuals with psychopathy vulnerable to being victims of violence?
Probably. They are certainly more likely to end up in altercations with other people. And if you are a frequent substance user, sometimes that can increase your risk for being victimized as well. There's a little evidence to suggest that people with psychopathy are don't live as long as people without psychopathy, because they are more likely to get into various risky situations that their fearless disposition doesn't keep them away from. And interpersonal violence is one of them. So yes, lots of bad things can happen to you too if you have high levels of psychopathy. And most people I know who have psychopathy describe a large number of scrapes that they've wound up in for one reason or another.
Lisa, any thoughts or follow-up?
No, I have considered, based on how my older child is so aggressive with people, and she has tried to get people fired, and she has reported people to the police and other things, that someone's going to not like how she messes with them and maybe do something to her. I've thought of that myself.
So certainly they could be in harm's way. That makes sense.
Yeah, because she's so inappropriately aggressive and accusatory and so interested in getting people in trouble.
Oh my.
Mhm.
All right. Well, thank you for those answers. And what should I do if a friend or family member seems to show psychopathic behaviors like lying or manipulating? How can I help them or sort of nudge them in the direction of getting help without putting them on the defensive? Or just don't do it?
It's always easiest when somebody is describing their own dissatisfaction with elements of their life, right? If somebody is saying, oh, I wish I didn't keep getting fired from my jobs, or I wish I didn't keep blowing up my romantic relationships, or I wish I had more friends. That's the time. And one of the things I love about family checkup therapy is because the way that family checkup works is it helps you set goals as a patient or a client. Like, what do you want to improve about your life? And the job of the clinician is just to help you come up with strategies to get there. And really, that's how good therapy should work a lot of the time. And so that gives you an in. If somebody's like, I hate this thing about my life, it keeps happening to me. It's hard. But the way to draw them out is to say, well, I wonder why that keeps happening. Like, do you think that there's any common thread? I mean, it doesn't happen to everybody. So like, I wonder why you think this might keep happening to you. Now, the problem with people with psychopathy is that, blame externalization is a feature of the disorder. It's not me. It's never me. It's always your fault. It's anybody else's fault but mine. And so, realistically, this can be an impediment to getting somebody to seek care. As can narcissism. So people who are psychopathic tend to be very narcissistic. And so if you think you're better than everybody else, well, if a problem arises, it was definitely the problem of one of these less good people out there, not you. So I'm not going to lie. I mean, these are impediments. But, eventually people with psychopathy can run out of excuses or run out of people to blame other than themselves. And that is when it's useful to point them in the direction of reliable resources like our website. One of our board members actually was talking with an office mate when she was a young adult who, in listening to her stories, said, I think you might want to consider the possibility that you're a sociopath, is the term that she used. And literally it had never occurred to our board member. And she went online and started looking up the details of psychopathy and was like, I think actually that replies to me really well. And that was the beginning of her starting to think, maybe I could do better in my life if I got some treatment. And it took her many therapists before she found somebody whose approach was effective. But it ended up working out really, really well to the benefit of everybody.
Right. And I think to some extent, we all have to sort of cross that barrier of grappling, like maybe I have a mental health challenge. Nobody's running to admit that, but once you can get to that point and embrace that help is available, treatment works, things can get a lot better.
Indeed.
All right. Do you have anything to add, Lisa?
Yeah, I do. My child seemed to not be able to learn from the experiences that she was having, that there was some interactional issue that was largely related to her. Although a tremendous difficulty maintaining friends, didn't have very many friends, although was very extroverted. So it's not that she was introverted. She totally wanted a lot of friends. She just couldn't keep them. And then various different groups that would have first welcomed her, then wound up kicking her out. And when I thought she would learn, was in a group that she had been not strongly associated with for a number of years, stopped inviting her to parties. I thought, oh, she'll figure it out now. No, that's not what happened. Oh, they're a bunch of jerks. So there was just, there wasn't learning. there wasn't curiosity on her part about what might I be contributing. It was completely externalized. This person's a jerk, so is that person, so is this person.
Yeah.
It went along with trying to get people fired, reporting people to the police, and there was kind of a third thing there. Yeah.
So yeah, that lack of insight. It's just hard to know.
Yeah.
Where do you go from there? It's hard to know. All right. Next question from Gary. Is there any correlation between psychopathy and suicide?
Probably the correlation is negative. That seems to be the most common conclusion, is that to the degree that people who have primary psychopathy are less likely to experience anxiety or depression, and certainly guilt and things, they don't experience that at all. So to the degree that that's associated with suicide, they're less likely to complete suicide. In fact, one of the sort of the earliest major texts on psychopathy was written by a clinician, a psychiatrist named Herbie Cleckley, who wrote a book called The Mask of Sanity that laid out the first set of sort of formal criteria for what constituted psychopathy. And I love that term for psychopathy because people who have psychopathy do often present as really normal or super normal in sort of an ordinary interaction. They often just seem so deeply undisordered. And in fact, and again, like often just like so fun and exciting and interesting, and not in a smarmy fake way, but like really enjoyable. And in fact, again, our board members with psychopathy, I legitimately really enjoy all of our discussions. It's interesting that way. And so that's what makes the differences under the surface, once you start finding out about them, so very surprising, because there's this big gap between what you see on the surface and what lies beneath. In any case, one of the criteria that Cleckley initially included as relevant to psychopathy was suicide rarely carried out. And that was mainly relative to other patients in psychiatric institutions where he worked. So compared to the other people that you see in psychiatric institutions, people with psychopathy are much less likely to carry out suicide. However, because they do have sort of impulsive, disinhibited behavior, and again, people who have secondary psychopathy who are very dysregulated, sometimes you'll see psychopathy because of those risk factors, but it does seem to be rarer than in other patient populations.
Interesting. It's interesting that lack of fear, that lack of remorse, lack of guilt would have that powerful effect on suicide completion rates. It makes sense. So many interesting variables to psychopathy that I just never even thought about it before. So is there a link between psychopathy and any kind of early childhood trauma, either psychological or a blow to the head, anything like that?
We're still trying to understand this. And one of the things I have to say is that there's so little research being done on this issue. We have so many gaps in our knowledge compared to every other common pediatric psychological disorder because the federal funding just isn't there. I can't do anything about it personally, but you know, there needs to be more federal funding, like, you know, parity at least with you know, depression and anxiety and these other conditions, and we have nothing even close to that now. So this is unfortunately one of the reasons there's such huge gaps in our knowledge. And as you might, you know, anticipate, this is not a topic that philanthropies are, you know, clamoring to devote resources to as well. And so it's a giant resource chasm that we're facing right now. And this is why we don't have as many answers as we would like to. It doesn't seem to be the case that psychopathy per se is caused by early childhood trauma or brain injuries. That said, you can certainly get outcomes where children act in aggressive and disinhibited ways due to early trauma or brain injuries. In fact, there are cases of people who have what's called acquired sociopathy is the, you know, term for it. That's the only place you'll see sociopathy in the scientific literature, interestingly, where a serious brain injury, usually to the front of the brain, to specific regions in the front of the brain, can make people act as though they have psychopathy by being, again, extremely impulsive and disinhibited and being more aggressive than they were before the injury. We know that children who have brain injuries, you know, depending on the injury, children's brains are much more plastic and are much better able to compensate, especially if the damage is to the surface of the brain. And so I think it's a completely open question whether you could get a child who acted psychopathic with a brain injury. I will say that's not the standard way that's not the cause of it. We know for sure that in general, children who develop psychopathy early on, it is not because of some sort of an injury or trauma.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for that answer. It does cover a lot of bases. Yeah, at least I hope that question didn't rub you the wrong way. It wasn't meant to be.
No.
Because I understand there are always people who are going to say it's the parents' fault. So.
I'm sure in some cases it's partly the parents' fault, just not my case or most of the parents that I know, or the few that I know with kids like this.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds like if the child has psychopathy or conduct disorder, then that's probably a whole different ball game. So we've got some more questions coming up. It's always a good sign. Okay, so a question from Kent about a child who says, "This is my life. I'm just going to live it the way I want to." Is that, I guess the question would be, is that a psychopathic attitude?
Sure. Yes. Yes. People, I mean, I ran into this working with children early on. We would interview them and ask them about how they generally felt about themselves, all the children we worked with. So the children who had psychopathic traits and the healthy kids. And we'd ask, how do you feel about yourself on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being I feel really terrible about myself and 10 being I feel awesome about myself. And a healthy kid, at least in the United States, will usually give you an answer of about a 7 or an 8. I feel pretty good about myself, but there's room for improvement. And the children who had psychopathic traits were routinely giving me answers like 10, 11. One kid said 20. And these are children whose objectively their lives are not going that well. They don't have any close friends. Their family members are frightened of them. They've been suspended or expelled from school. But they don't feel worried about any of it. They have a very healthy sense of self-confidence, verging on narcissism in many cases. And they blame other people for their problems. And so when that's the case, what's the motivation to change? And that can be the real difficulty as people get older. That said, there are people who have callous personalities who aren't very nice people, but they have developed good ability to self-regulate. So they probably wouldn't qualify as truly psychopathic, and their lives are going fine. And if that's the case, maybe you're not the nicest person in the world, but if you're generally functioning in major life domains like work, family, school, and you're not experiencing a lot of distress, you technically don't have a disorder. In order for something to be considered a clinical disorder, it has to impair your ability to function in one or more domains, and or cause significant distress.
Okay. I'm looking over the questions here. Lisa and Dr. Marsh, what would you like us to know about psychopathy that hasn't already been covered?
What do you think, Lisa?
I guess it's already been covered, but that the fact you have psychopathy does not mean you were abused by your parents, or maybe not even treated poorly by your parents. It's been covered, but it bears saying again.
Sure.
Oh, also there's another thing, actually. My favorite misconception that people have about people who have mental health conditions is you can tell by talking to someone for half an hour or certainly an hour if they have a mental health condition. And that is such a hard and fast myth that I'd like people to know, that you can't tell by talking to someone for an hour or even maybe working with them for a month if they have psychopathy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, good point. It's episodic. If they're having a good day or a good month.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we've touched on all the major myths that I usually like to point out. That it's not caused by bad parenting or abuse or trauma, although all of those things can cause other problems, but not psychopathy per se. It's not associated necessarily with violence or crime. So people who have psychopathy are at risk for engaging in violence and crime, but many people with psychopathy don't do either. That it is treatable. So there is a pervasive myth that psychopathy is untreatable. So even if you do identify, what's the point? Because there's nothing that can be done, which is not true. It's challenging to treat, but I have a lot of hope that as more research gets done with the help of people like Lisa and hopefully in the future federal funders as well, that we'll be able to develop even better treatments that we have now. So I'm hopeful about that.
Right. Well, that does sound encouraging. So does the lack of fear lead a person with psychopathy to risky or high adrenaline behavior? That's a yes.
Yes, that's a big yes. We on our YouTube channel, actually, there are some wonderful interviews with people with psychopathy who talk about how often their lack of fear gets them into terrible trouble, and sometimes ends up getting other people they know into trouble, who they say, "Come on, let's do it; it'll be fun." Every kind of scrape under the sun that you can think of. One of the people that we interviewed is actually a neuroscientist. He's not a member of our board, but he's a very well-known neuroscientist himself. His name is James Fallon. And he has what I think he would classify as subclinical psychopathy, which I think is about right. The main reason for that is he has pretty good inhibitory ability. And so he's able to keep his behavior just below the level at which he would be truly damaging his relationships or his ability to work. But he describes all sorts of times where he realized he was being a really bad friend because he was getting his friends into trouble. People end up almost dying because of all the sort of hijinks that end up on him. Pretty sure I remember him saying that he went running with the bulls once and one of his friends got really badly injured. I think I'm remembering that correctly. It's that sort of thing. Definitely.
Interesting. So he's that guy. Like, let's do this. Let's go running with the bulls.
Yeah, let's go, ride our bikes off the roof of the school. Let's go, whitewater rafting with no guide and no experience. You name it.
Gotcha.
Fear is a really healthy emotion. I mean, I think it's a very, in some ways, kind of North American tendency to see fear as this bad emotion that we should try to get rid of and stamp out. But fear is not a bad emotion. Fear is a very good emotion. You don't want it to get carried away. You don't want to be afraid of things that are not objectively risky. And sort of live your life ruled by fear. But fear is a very good servant. It gives us very valuable information that can keep us from getting hurt. So it's a useful emotion to listen to. And if you don't have that emotion, you end up getting in a lot of trouble.
That makes perfect sense. Lisa?
I'd say in the case of my daughter, I don't think that she was particularly physically bold, at least not when she was younger. But her utter lack of fear of me caused her her coldness combined with her lack of fear caused her to treat me in utterly extreme ways, including just storming out on me, slamming doors practically in my face, all sorts of rude behavior to other people as well because of coldness, coupled with lack of fear of the other person's upset.
Wow, that sounds very challenging to live with. Well, let's end on this note. Oh, let me make some announcements real quick. We are off the next 2 weeks for Thursdays with NAMI. We're taking a holiday break, but we will be back in 2022. Please join us on January 6th. We'll be talking about what's new in 2022. Also known as what keeps Executive Director Gary Kreitz and his board up at night. Join us for this conversation. It will be fascinating. Also, please fill out the survey that appears when you leave your Zoom session. If you're joining us via Zoom, it helps us improve over time and it helps us with grant funding. Panelists, one final question. What gives you hope?
A lot of things give me hope, but one of them is this new organization that we've managed to create this year. Lisa and I, Psychopathy it's the first of its kind. It's been growing really fast, and I think is already providing a lot of value for people and families who are affected by psychopathy. And I have a lot of hope that as time goes on, it's going to be able to fill in a lot of our gaps in knowledge and resources even more.
And also for me, psychopathy gives me a lot of hope, as well as Dr. Marsh's future research, as well as future research of other people doing psychopathy research.
All right, very good. Well, check it out, psychopathyis.org. You want to go take the test, read up, check out all those wonderful resources, and they have some neat testimonials from family members and folks who live with the disorder. It's really good stuff. And I think that's all we've got for tonight. Thank you again so much, Lisa Michael and Dr. Abigail Marsh. It's been a wonderful conversation. I've really enjoyed getting to know you. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel very soon. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Have a wonderful, safe holiday.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Good night.
Right.